praise you, Lord, for your mercy, your grace, and unmerited favor toward us. Thanks for this time to get together and look into your word. I pray that you will speak to our hearts. May we be receptive in your Holy Spirit. Speak to us and guide us in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Breakups. You ever have a breakup in your life? In high school, one of the first girlfriends that I had a crush on her, and we dated for about a month or so, and then I broke up with her, and maybe I was a sophomore in high school. I didn't know anything. And by junior year, I think I realized that I shouldn't have done that, and so I pursued this person again. And we dated for a while, but then she broke up with me. And she said, you know what, I just need some space. And so what I did was I took a piece of paper and I put 2 lines on it, and I put arrows in between, and I put space. And I put it on my shirt. And I showed it to her, and I was kind of making a point to show her that, I cared about her and so forth. And so breakups in those days are pretty meaningless because you're so young. But nowadays, some of us might have been touched by the breaking up of a family through a divorce, or maybe you've heard of someone who's gone through a difficult time as a child of a divorce. Or maybe you've been touched by divorce itself. But any kind of, loosing or breaking up of a marriage is very serious. And Jesus addresses it here in Mark chapter 10. But he doesn't address it in the sense of teaching on it. He's actually challenged by the Pharisees about the issue. And one of the things that it's good to know when you're reading this is that Jesus has just come back into his home region in Judea. He's not any longer with the Gentiles, but he's here with his fellow people, the Jews, and the Pharisees are testing him, and they want to debate and they want to argue. They want to catch Jesus in something that he might say. And back in that time, there were 2 schools of Jewish thought on the issue of divorce. There was one school that thought that a man could divorce his wife for any reason. If she burned the food, he could divorce her legitimately. If he didn't like her for some reason, he could just say, she doesn't find favor in my eyes, so therefore I'm going to divorce her. But then there was another school of thought who said, no, that's not right. That's not moral. That's not what Moses wanted for us. And the only time for a legitimate divorce would be if there was immorality by the wife. And so if you didn't notice, I never spoke about the privilege that the wife had in those types of situations, because back in that culture she didn't have money. She didn't have much. She couldn't ask for a divorce from her husband if she was Jewish. Only the male privileged society allowed men to do that. And so Jesus is being addressed by his Jewish counterparts, his opposition, and these happen to be scholars. And this type of thing is important for the community to kind of have some insight on, but I think it's important to know the context of what Jesus was writing about. And so what we want to see is how Jesus succeeds in silencing his opponents on a hot button issue. How Jesus answers his opposition regarding the breaking up of God's work in the family. And the first thing we see is that we have to know the intent of the related commandment. We have to know the intent of the commandment that is related to the issue that we're trying to get light upon, that we're trying to understand the truth upon. And we see that in verses 1 through 5. It says, "Getting up, Jesus went from there to the region of Judea and beyond the Jordan, and crowds gathered around him once again, and according to his custom, he once more began to teach them." Here goes Jesus coming back into Judea. He definitely has done this a couple times. He crosses over the lake and ends up being more focused in the Gentile territory, and then he comes back. He's trying to avoid the popularity crowds that he's getting because of his miracles, because of his provisions of food for so many people, and he's just so popular that he just escapes. But he can't really go anywhere else because his mission is focused in that area. But he teaches them because he sees the opportunity to provide instruction to people who are lost and off the track. But what do you know? The first people he run into are the Pharisees. Pharisees, verse 2, came to Jesus. And already we've seen that they are opposing him, that they're testing him. And it tells us here that they're testing him, and they began to question him whether it was lawful for a man to divorce a wife. So the Pharisees come up and they say, "Jesus, we got a question for you." Don't you think they would have learned already? They tried to do this to him earlier and he schooled them. But no, we're going to do it again. We got the hot button issues. Let's see what we can do. Let's see if we can get Jesus to offend some of his crowd, or maybe he can say something that's against some of the ruling leaders and we can use it to accuse him. And so they're like, "Jesus, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife?" Lawful meaning in relationship to the law of God. Now Jesus, in this case, does answer their question. He doesn't just ignore them. He doesn't, throw them back something that, puts them spinning in a loop. But he says, "How did Moses command you?" And so his challenge is on the same turf as their thinking is. Their thinking is, we have Moses. We've given our allegiance to Moses because he's our leader. God gave the law through him, and therefore we want to keep in line with him. And as we've talked about earlier, from generation down, they'd passed down these traditions that have totally obscured the original intent Moses had in the law. And so, but Jesus meets them on their turf. He's like, "Okay, you guys are Moses' followers. Let's talk about Moses. What did he say to you?" And their response is, "Moses permitted a man to write a certificate of divorce and send her away." That's a huge quotation from Deuteronomy 24, and I can't avoid going there because it's a difficult passage and it needs to be looked at. So look there, Deuteronomy 24, 1 through 4. Now this passage is well known to them. It's probably a little bit obscure for maybe some of us, but during this time, the context of this is that Moses had given instruction to a people who were rebellious. In several places within the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses, there is the idea that this is a stiff-necked people and they go astray, and God makes them a promise and says, "Look, Moses, as soon as we get into the promised land, these people are going to go astray after other idols." And so Deuteronomy 24, 1 through 4 says, "When a man," and try to listen carefully to this is an instruction. "When a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes, because he has found some indecency in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out from his house. And she leaves his house and goes and becomes another man's wife. And if the latter husband turns against her and writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, or if the latter husband dies who took her to be his wife, then her former husband who sent her away is not allowed to take her again to be his wife, since she has been defiled. for that is an abomination before the Lord, and you shall not bring sin on the land which the Lord your God gives you as an inheritance. And so there's a couple things in there, more than two actually, but the two main things that are like hanging, everything else is hanging on, is that a man takes a wife and she finds no favor in his eyes because of some indecency in her. And that original debate between the Jewish schools of the two views on divorce in the Jewish day was based upon that term indecency. And some people took it as he finds no favor, she finds no favor in his eyes, meaning he just doesn't like her. So therefore he can divorce her as long as he gives her a certificate of divorce. The other guys said no, it means that he finds some kind of immorality that either she had done previously or maybe she was in at the point. But the idea was most likely the Jewish man expected his wife to be a virgin, and maybe she wasn't when it comes time to consummate the marriage. And so he generally would have just sent her out of his house, which is pretty harsh in the first place. But Moses gives a command that says you got to give her a certificate. You got to give her some papers, because you can't just go sending this person out of your house, because she could be subject to the stoning of various people who would assume that she was guilty of adultery. And so the idea was that the certificate of divorce gave people who she would in contact with, and it also protected her economic status. So if she was known as a divorced woman and she had no proof that she had any innocence, she would be very severely economically disadvantaged, and she would not be able to remarry, and also she would be in high disfavor in society. So Moses' command is dealing with a custom that was already going on. So it's almost like he's putting in some safeguards, because these people were so off track of what God's intended purpose was for marriage, that he says, no, protect the innocent person by giving them a certificate that says that you divorced them, and probably they had to state the reason for it, and so forth, so that person would not be looked down upon in society. And so you go back to Mark 10, and that original permission, I will permit you to, Moses really didn't even permit them to divorce. He permitted them to give a certificate more in the protection of the other spouse. And it says, Moses permitted a man to write a certificate of divorce and send her away. Now by the time Jesus' day comes around, they're taking that original permission and they're making it a norm for divorce. So they're taking something that was more of an extreme case, and they're making it the normal rule of law for people who are seeking any divorce. And that is not the original intent of the commandment that Moses gave. So Jesus says, because of your hardness of heart, Moses wrote you this commandment. Moses did not write the commandment to the Pharisees. Jesus ups the ante and says, Moses wrote this commandment to you guys. And it's a strong challenge. It's kind of an indicting type of statement, because the original commandment was written to somebody, 1,000 years earlier. But the same types of people that were seeking those illegitimate divorces back then are the same types of people that Jesus was encountering. And so they went from a permission and a concession to a regulation and a commonality. So he took something that was permitted for the sake of the innocent person and made it into something that was very common. Not good. So that was a disregard of the original intent of Deuteronomy 24. Now, if you guys think of, like the Golden Gate Bridge or something like that, where there's the bridge, right? And you drive across it and you walk across it and you got to get from one side to the other. But without all those other supports and those cables that come down and hold the suspension of the bridge together, and the supports that go deep into the water and hold it to the earth, that bridge would do nothing for us. It would be dangerous. So all that supporting material factors into the integrity of the bridge. It's the same thing with this commandment in Deuteronomy. The intent and the context and the situation and the occasion that it was given all factors into helping it be what it should be. If you take that away and you just give her a certificate and you can do anything you want, that is not the original intent. It's not safe to go down that road. And so that's the challenge of that. And we have people in our day that, I think it was Lindsay Lohan or some celebrity who, just because she wanted to one night, just got married to her friend, but just for that night, and then they divorced like 24 hours later. I mean, that's just, it's ridiculous. It's a meaningless thing to them. It's just like, let's just do this tonight. And next week we're going to, do this. And that's one of the things you're going to do on the weekend. So they're not understanding the original intent for command and divorce and marriage. But the second thing, now Jesus is tested by these Pharisees to see where he's at with their Jewish, theology, and he exceeds them, of course. But the second thing he does is he keeps in line with God's original design. Jesus keeps in line, he keeps the straight and narrow with what God originally intended. That's in verses 6 through 9. Now, he moves on and they challenged him on Moses. They were like, hey, Moses, what does Moses say? We love Moses. He's like, you want Moses? I'll give you Moses, but let's go all the way back to Genesis. Let's go back to when things were there was no sin. You're dealing with a situation in Deuteronomy that had to do with a lot of sin and regulating people who were getting out of control. Let's go back to when there was no sin and when things were more ideal for a command. And he goes to verse 6, he says, but from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother, and the two shall become one flesh, and they are no longer two, but one flesh. What God therefore has joined together, let no man separate. So that's going back to God's original design for marriage. He had to do that to these guys because they were obscured in their view. Their view was passed on from generation to generation. It's the same thing happens to us every week. Every time you're in church or anytime you listen to the Christian radio or you read a book and someone quotes a verse and they don't quote the verse in context or they quote it to support a meaning that is not the original intention of it, they're passing on a tradition that they've been passed on about that verse, and they're not going back to the original design God had. It happens all the time with us. So he says, go back to the garden. God made them male and female. He did not make them male and male in order to become one flesh. Just throw that out there. He made them male and female, and the reason is because he took out of man part of his body and made the woman out of it. And when they come back in marriage to be one, it's bringing back a unity of what was originally the creation of man. Man was originally created by himself, and God takes part of man and makes woman, and then brings woman back to be part of the man through marriage. Doesn't work with a man and a man. For this reason, and I think it's for the reason of the bringing back of the woman and the man for unity, the man shall leave his father and mother, and the two shall become one flesh. Now, this is what I read about this, and this is pretty significant. All of Jesus' address up to this point, and even past this point, is to the man. because, like I said, this society was male privileged. It was, the men had the decisions to make. Women didn't have a lot of rights. And so he throws it at the men there, and he says, you leave your father and mother, and are joined to your wife. He didn't say the woman leaves her parents and is joined, because he knew that the woman didn't really have a choice a lot of the time. And so the original design was that they would be joined together, and they're joined together by God. And when God joins something together, man shouldn't try to break it apart, is what Jesus is saying. And what they were trying to do was they were seeking divorce for frivolous, petty things that were not what God intended for families to break apart over. So, we always had to do this. We always have to go back to the original and take a look at it ourselves. And there's nothing new. And these things, they may seem new. We may seem like, oh wow, there's this new movement in the Christian world going on, emerging church or anything like that. Just take another look at it. There's one thing that I thought of, and maybe you disagree here, but bullying. Have you heard of bullying? What's bullying? It's like, isn't it just aggressive behavior? Isn't that like fighting, kind of? Isn't that what Pharaoh did to the Israel? I mean, like, is bullying really new? Isn't that just like being mean? I don't know. To me, it just seems like it's already been around for a while. It's just got a new name and a new avenue to be done through. It's nothing new. It goes back to the original times of just mistreating someone. So none of this stuff should be new to us. It should be something where we can explore it in its original context. But that's what we need to do. We need to keep in line with God's original design for marriage, and that doesn't take into account the fact that we live in a sinful world. Because the sinful world, there are broken relationships, there are broken marriages. And we'll talk about that in a minute here. The last thing we see is that Jesus ups the ante to drive us to take him more seriously. Jesus throws in all his chips on the table because he wants us to get the point. And this happens only after the disciples question him back in the house. So they get back into the house, the Pharisees leave, and Jesus says, and the disciples are like, hey, Jesus, man, what did you say there about Moses and Deuteronomy? And Jesus is like, whoever divorces his wife and marries another woman commits adultery against her. Now, and he adds this part in. If she herself divorces her husband and marries another man, she is committing adultery. The first phrase, whoever divorces his wife, this is another shot at the Pharisees, at the Jewish man at this time. Because in this phrase, it says, commits adultery against her. But in the second phrase, where the woman seeks the divorce, it doesn't say against him. And I think the idea is, this is something I got a commentary by Robert Gundry. He said, Jesus is upping the ante for the status of women in this situation, because when the man, he had easy access to divorce, but the women really did not. And only in this case Jesus mentions a woman getting divorced because the community that Mark was writing to was a Gentile community, and they might have had more of a privilege for a woman to divorce her husband. But I think it might be also a hint of a rebuke at what Herodias did with Herod. Because earlier in Mark, we read this several weeks ago, was that Herodias divorced her husband and married her brother, her husband's former husband's brother. So that was almost like a hint of what Herodias did was not right. But Jesus leaves it up to the man. And now, here's the thing about this, and I want to say this because Jesus there's something about what Jesus said, the actual words of what he said, and the meaning of what he says. Sometimes they're one and the same. Sometimes there's a little bit of a difference. Now, what we know in Matthew and in Corinthians and different passages that talk about divorce, there are exceptions for a biblical divorce to happen. And the reason it doesn't come up in Mark is because it doesn't seem like that was the intention of Jesus, is to give a full teaching on divorce. He's not doing that here. He's actually responding to someone's tests. Someone wants to debate him and argue with him. And so he wasn't teaching on divorce. These guys came up to him. And so he's trying to rebuke and rebut them. So that's one thing to take in mind. The other thing is that Jesus upheld Deuteronomy, which in my opinion, allows for the innocent person of a divorce the ability to remarry biblically, because that was the reason for the papers certificate to be given. And so I think when Jesus says whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her, in Matthew it's the same wording, but he puts except for immorality. So Matthew says whoever divorces his wife except for immorality and marries another commits adultery against her. I think that probably Mark implies that because of the Deuteronomy discussion, but he just doesn't have it in there. And so also they assumed that divorce generally led to remarriage, so they don't really spell it out here, because just because you get a divorce doesn't mean you commit adultery, because it doesn't say anything about anyone remarrying in other passages. But in this case, it seems like it's assuming that it's an unbiblical divorce. And then in Corinthians, there's a discussion about a spouse who decides not to live with one who's not a Christian and the other's a Christian, and the unbeliever leaves the marriage. It says the believer is no longer bound or obligated in those situations. And what that entails, I'm not completely 100% sure on, but it doesn't necessarily... It probably means that they're not entailed to try to keep the marriage together, because God has called us to peace, it says. But in this case, Jesus wants the disciples to understand the seriousness, because back then, as is oftentimes now, we see, like Elizabeth Taylor, I think she had like 7 husbands or so. Back then, this is what they did. And he says, let me say this statement so you get my point. I'm going to be really serious. And, we don't do that too often, but I remember one professor saying, sometimes in your ministry, the church you're ministering for, or whoever it may be, will really challenge you on an issue, and there might be one time that you're going to say, you know what, if you go this route, I'm out. Or if you don't go this route, I'll stay. But you don't do that more than once. You do it like, he always say, you do it once. You put all your chips in once. And so that's what kind of Jesus is doing. He's like, wants his disciples to really get the point. And so I think, to summarize this, I think that it just shows us that Jesus held a high standard, and he wanted to go back to the original design of what God had given in that scenario of marriage. So, any questions on this? I know it's...
Yeah, I read long ago about that issue of divorce.
Yeah.
And that, during that time, it was common practice.
Right.
However, outside of God's order.
Right.
For